Shalom, and welcome to this, our 8th edition of Contextual Bible Study. My name is Denny Thompson. For this study, we're actually going to leave Israel. We're going to go into the country of Jordan. And the title of this is Return to Sodom. Overview map. You can see Egypt in the foreground, at the bottom left, the big Sinai Peninsula, Israel on the left, Jordan on the right, and in the valley that contains the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee. And the Dead Sea is going to be our focus today, the northern end. I mentioned before, there's a huge crack in the Earth's crust called the Rift Valley that goes right through here. These two huge plates of the Earth are pulling apart, creating this very, very deep area, the lowest area on the planet, Dead Sea being about 1,400 feet below sea level. And the Sea of Galilee, the lowest freshwater lake in the world, is 700 feet below sea level. Now, we first are going to go to take a look at this hotel we stayed in. I just wanted to show you a couple kind of neat pictures. And you can see the arrow pointing to the north of the Dead Sea called Sodom. That's going to be the focus of today. But first, a couple pictures at the hotel. We stayed in the northern end of the Dead Sea, in the bigger part of the Dead Sea. So this is looking across the Dead Sea from our hotel balcony. It was a really neat place to stay. It was great. The archaeology work was difficult, but the hotel was a great place to relax at night. But looking across, we see Israel. Pretty amazing just to look at it all the time, just right there, looking at a map. That deep valley, it's called a wadi, carved from the water rushing down from the mountains to the low area. It's called the Kidron Valley. That's the one that goes all the way up to Jerusalem. And that's the one that Ezekiel prophesied one day there would be living water flowing down that valley, making the Dead Sea come alive. So we're literally looking at Bible prophecy here. This is a picture of us, my wife Sherry and I, standing at night down by the Dead Sea. And a little hard to tell, but we're actually looking at an elevation about 4,000 feet higher in the distance, those lights. To the left of Sherry is Bethlehem. It's about 60,000 people today. In Jesus' time period, it was just a sleepy little village. And to the right of me is Jerusalem, which is approximately 1 million people. Now, why did we go to Sodom? What's the story behind this? Well, I read a book a few years ago by this guy, Eric Matexas, excellent writer, and that's what triggered my curiosity. And he says he kept bumping into outrageous evidence for God and points to two specific examples. The first is a biblical discovery of Sodom, and the second is where does life come from? Now, as I read that, I thought, Sodom, what do you mean? I always thought it was like at the southern end of the Dead Sea, and we really didn't know much about it. But as I read what he wrote, it was fascinating, and it just triggered my interest. So I began to dig deeper and deeper, and it brought me to this university, Trinity Southwest University, because they're the sponsors of this dig, which actually been going on for 16 years. It's called Tal el-Hammam in Jordan. Tal means a mound or a hill. Hammam actually means hot springs. So that's what it's called. And you can see a picture of some of the workers beneath here. So I called the university and I asked, is there any chance that you want more volunteers to help in the dig? And they said, sure. So we decided to do it. Checked with my wife, Sherry, and mentioned it to her. And a lot of wives would probably say, go, have a good time. We'll see you when you get back. But Sherry said, let's do it. I'm all in on this. So that was pretty cool. I should mention, too, from what I mentioned last week about what I went through with my eye. She was a real rock in helping me out with that, too, that whole situation. So where was Sodom? As I mentioned, early thought was it was way down here. But in recent years, discoveries, which we're going to learn about right now, it points to the fact that it's up here to the north, the northwest. And here's the head of the archaeology department at university. His name is Dr. Stephen Collins. He's the one I'll be quoting a lot because it's his study, his work, that came to this conclusion. He's pointing to Sodom. I got a little arrow pointing to Mount Nebo above it because we're going to look at that too and kind of in context. That's, of course, where Moses had the Israelites taught him these great lessons that God had given to him about what's going to happen when they enter into Israel. So here's a bigger picture. Way in the distance up in the mountains is Amman. That's the capital of Jordan. To the right is Mount Nebo. Tel el-Hammam, you can see the arrow pointing to it. The Dead Sea is the north end, and then the Jordan River, which is very small today. Now, so what was this about? Why did Dr. Collins begin to think that Sodom is at the north end of the Dead Sea rather than the south, like generally accepted? Well, he always thought that didn't seem right. There seemed to be a lot of issues that didn't match up. So he just pulled the scriptures out and read them again. And here's the big clue to start with. Standing between Bethel and Ai, Abraham and Lot had large flocks. The land could not support both living together. So Abraham suggested they separate, and he gave Lot his choice. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left. Now, this is real significant, these directions. I'll show you in the next slide here. You can see the dot between Bethel and Ai approximately, and see the arrow pointing towards Sodom. So Sodom would be directly east of that area. Hebrew did not have cardinal directions. Everything is based on east because that's the rising of the sun. East is always, you always face to your forward would be east. That meant west would be backwards from where you're standing. And if you picture standing like that, north would be to your left, and your right hand would be pointing south. So Abraham assumed, remember we said right or left, that if I go north, you go south, or reverse. He assumed that Lot wanted to stay right in Israel, obviously, because that's where they were. That was the promised land. But the scriptures tell us Lot looked around and saw that the whole plain, this word kikar is going to be important, plain, and it's kikar in Hebrew, of the Jordan towards Zoar was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. This is before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain, the whole kikar of Jordan, and he set towards the east. Now, this had to be kind of shocking to Abraham because he knew about Sodom. He knew all about it. Sodom's reputation had way preceded this time period. And so he had to be thinking, not a good choice, but he let him go ahead and do what he asked here. So that's east, and that's the direction that Lot is going to go. Now, a couple more details in this description. The whole plain, the kikar, what does that mean? Now, this is another clue that Dr. Collins looked at, indicating that this is the right place. It had to be east of Bethel and Ai, and this Sodom that we're going to look at is exactly east of the area. So, the kikar, what does that mean? It means circle or disc. You can see right here, this part of that's the Jordan River going from Dead Sea to the Sea of Galilee. This part of the valley is much rounder, much bigger. And we refer to that as the kikar. It's literally kind of a disc or a circle. And that word kikar, and you can see this part of the valley is much more narrow. It widens out. The kikar widens much more out down in the southern part, which is directly across Bethel and Ai. And Sodom is on the other side, as we'll learn. The word kikar is sometimes also used to describe a shekel, which is round bread, or even a roundabout in terms of road in modern day Israel. They use that term. So, another bigger view here, the Dead Sea at minus 1,400. Sodom is, you can picture where it's circle, is minus 700, which means it's uphill 700 feet from the Dead Sea. And then there's the Jordan River in that area there. And then here's another view of the kikar, this round, fertile area. Now, Lot looked around and saw the whole plain of the Jordan towards Zoar was well watered like the garden of the Lord. Now, what's being referred to here, the garden of the Lord? Well, that's the Garden of Eden. Lot looked around and saw that, just the fact it's well watered like the garden of the Lord. And the garden of the Lord, or Eden, had a river that flowed through it. Well, so does this area, the Jordan River. Even though today it's very, very small, back then it was way larger, much larger for various reasons. And even back in the Old Testament times, you will hear references to some of these exotic animals that lived in this valley because it was very, very wide and very lush and had a lot of undergrowth. Elephants, lions, hippopotamus, rhinoceros, leopards, boars, ibex, and even alligators. So the next little detail here of that very same description, it said, like the land of Egypt, garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. So the reference there would be, which the Israelites are going to be familiar with, is going to be the Nile River. That's the land of Egypt. And then Egypt is very dry except around the Nile where it flooded every year. And you can literally see it's sometimes called the green ribbon. Well, the Jordan River flooded too. In fact, it flooded a lot back in those days. Up to 2 to 3 miles wide was the Jordan River during this flood stages. Now, that's not true today anymore. It was true back then. So it was very, very wide. That would be mainly during the spring. That area that's listed as crossing is where Joshua would have crossed. And it's also the area that Jesus probably was baptized by John the Baptist. And you can see that Jericho is directly across from Sodom with Mount Nebo above. Around Sodom are all kinds of springs, and that's significant too in terms of being well watered. This is a picture of one of them. So I mentioned when Joshua crossed the river, remember what happened? The waters backed up before the priests stepped into that what's going to be dry land with the Ark of the Covenant. Well, remember that was during they were going to celebrate Passover right after. So that's springs. That's when it's flooded. So it was a very wide river at that point, making this miracle even more amazing. So the two men parted company. Abraham lived in the land of Canaan, so he went right, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. Now the people of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. All right, so here's a picture of this gigantic mound. Today it's called el-Hammam, which means Hill of the Hot Springs, that Dr. Collins, and you'll see as we go through this, believes is Sodom. It's by far the biggest mound in this area, or tell in Hebrew it's tell, in this area. So he figured, okay, that's a giant clue. It's directly across from Bethel and Ai. It's the biggest one by far. Nothing's even close. And how is that significant? Well, Hebrew always lists the largest first, and Sodom is always listed first in terms of the other cities, what we call the cities of the plain of this Kikar area. And a tell in Hebrew, or a tall in Arabic, simply means a mound that it had several levels of civilization beneath. The further you go down, the more back in time. Why do they put a new city on top of an ancient city? Because the location was chosen for a reason. Probably source of water, good farmland, transportation routes. So there's all kinds of reasons. Normally, there may be 150 years apart between different cities once they're destroyed and they're rebuilt. But in the case of Sodom, there was this massive gap of 700 years between any evidence of civilization. So that's significant, very significant. So here's the upper city. That's actually where we worked. And the lower city doesn't look as large here, but it's much larger than the upper city. The angle makes it look a little different here, as we'll see in a little bit. And notice down below to the right, where it says mosque, there's a mosque down there. This is obviously a Muslim country, and we got to know the people in the area who actually, this is privately owned land, actually. And they're Muslim, and they worship in that mosque right there. But see where it says tools to the right? Well, every morning we would gather the tools and put them on this little truck, which we call Camel 1. Pretty strategically placed in order to get those up there. Very steep road, very, very steep, going up to the upper city. So that going up to the top of the tall. Now, Gomorrah. Immediately you think of Gomorrah after Sodom. What was that? Well, we think it's over to that right where the arrow's pointing. It's very small compared to Sodom. It's like we would call it like a suburb. And these little, they call them sister cities, would go to the big gated walled city in a time of danger, going inside the gates. So here's where we think it is, not known for sure, right there. So you can see it's much smaller. We believe that's Gomorrah, although they have really not done hardly any work on it yet to check that out, to verify it. Okay, back to el-Hammam or Sodom. This obviously became a symbol of God's judgment through the Old Testament, all the Gospels, 2 Peter, Jude, Revelation, and it could be seen easily from Jerusalem. Everybody knew the story. So if you're way up, now we're in Israel on this picture right here, looking down into that deep, deep valley. And way down there was Sodom. So from the edge of the hills, Judean hills, everyone could see Sodom and everyone knew the story. First inhabited about 4,000 BC. That's amazing. It's one of the most ancient places in the world. Now, it was destroyed between 1650 and 1700, and I'm going to talk about that date in just a minute here. When Moses came here, which he did come here into this area, and it's very possible they stayed on top of this area, I'll talk about that in a minute, was about 1350 probably. And there was this 700-year gap I mentioned. And the next thing that was built on here was during the age of the monarchy. It became what we call a storage city or a tax collection city. To the right is the eras of the Bronze Age, the early Bronze. You can see the dates way back 3300, 21. Well, this is the Middle Bronze, what we call the Middle Bronze Age, this time period. Now, in terms of the date, when we go 1650, 1700, many people think Abraham lived, and this would have been around 1900, 1950, or maybe even 2000. Now, so that would not match up with what I'm going to describe here, what Dr. Collins learned. But a couple things here. Chronology in the Bible is not emphasized, so it's very hard to get dates. They were not into that. They were into the story, not the dates of the story. Like we're into the dates and the time period. They were not at all. So that makes things challenging. So the question is, really, how long were the Israelites in Egypt? Now, some of you might remember, we hear the number 400 and 430 different times. But the question is, was that how long you're in Egypt, or is that is that number of years meaning something different? Well, here's a verse in Galatians that kind of gives us a gigantic clue. The promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed. What I mean is this: the law introduced 430 years later does not set aside the covenant previously established by God and thus do away with the promise. So in other words, what is being said here by Paul is that he's dating it from the promise, the blood covenant that we talked about, to Sinai. That's the 430 years, not the time that they were in Egypt. So that would be the whole time period. So the time in Egypt would be way less, maybe only 200 years to get an idea. And what I have beneath there is a really good article, goes into some depth if any of you are interested in reading about it. I don't have the time to go into it right here, but you can look that over and copy it and then look it up on your own if you choose to. When they first started digging in this area about 16 years ago, didn't have to go very far down at all. And they began to discover some things in this area. And it wasn't so much further down that they discovered this kind of a sulfur smell, which is kind of, like, what's that about? Wondering what's the sulfur smell about? And when they got down, into this little bit lower areas, they could see this. These are layers of ash everywhere. And that's going to be ultimately the period of destruction, which we'll talk about. They carbon-14 dated it between 1650 and 1700 BC. Now, in establishing dates in archaeology is kind of like a circumstantial detective case. You're trying to piece together all these facts and try to tell a story. Because, it's not like there's a great big sign that says, "Welcome to Sodom." So it's difficult. They got to put it together. How do they do it? Well, pottery is a big one, because pottery can be determined in different styles and different periods of time. And Dr. Collins is one of the foremost experts in the entire world in terms of pottery. Another one is this carbon-14 dating you've probably heard of, and that only relates to things that were once alive, living objects like grain or bones, pieces of bones of a person or an animal. And what they do is they take 3 samples to date, 3 samples of one object to get a clear dating, and it can date within 50 years, which is pretty accurate. Now we're looking back up at Mount Nebo. We're going to look at that for a second. Now we're on Mount Nebo, up on top. You can see the Dead Sea to your left, and you can see Sodom in front of us. And of course, Moses was buried somewhere in that valley, in the plains of Moab. So in the land of Moab. So somewhere in that area, we don't know where, he was ultimately buried. Another picture, kind of a panoramic view I took from the top here. And you can see Sodom. It's a little hard to see Jericho, but it's in the distance from Sodom. We'll see it closer in a minute. Right across, Dead Sea to your left. There it is, a little bit closer, more zoomed in, Sodom. And then across the Jordan River is Jericho. And we know they went from these plains of Moab into Jericho and fought this massive battle. That's where that took place. Now, here's a short little video this area. Just I kind of took a panoramic view, and I'm going to stop at the end of it at Sodom, and then in the picture after that, I'm going to zoom in on it. Okay, now here's where I'm zooming in right there. Okay, so that's where it would look like. That's where it is from Mount Nebo. All right, back to this tell again. All right, I mentioned it was first inhabited probably that far back, 4,000. But when Moses came here, it had been empty for years. It had been destroyed many, many years ago. So it was an empty, probably it might have looked somewhat like it does today. Now, there's a verse in Numbers that kind of gives us a clue that maybe, just maybe, we know that they camped around this area exactly, and they maybe camped right on top of it because they left the mountains of Abarim, which is Nebo, which we just looked at, and camped on the plains of Moab. You know where that is. It's this whole area around here by the Jordan across from Jericho. There on the plains of Moab, they camped along the Jordan River from Beth Jeshimoth to Abel Shatim. Now, Beth Jeshimoth literally means the house of waste or desert. And I think there was references sometimes to the destroyed Sodom being called that. So it's possible. And in Abel Shatim means acacia trees, and they're everywhere, even to this day around this area. It's an area of acacia trees. Here's some younger ones that we were walking around. I just took a picture here to show. All right, so did they camp here? Possibly. It would have been a great strategic location getting ready to go across to Jericho. Now, here's Jericho looking from the edge of Sodom across, and so you can see you're going to cross the river, and that's where all that great miracle happened, right across to Jericho. This is massive, 70 acres. Now, in terms of cities today it's not massive, but in terms of the ancient world, it's absolutely huge. One of the biggest in the world, or maybe the biggest. To give you an idea, Jerusalem and Jericho were each only 7 acres, and Sodom is 70 acres, or just under 68 to 70 acres. And it's always listed first and sometimes alone, indicating it's big. It's the largest city of the area. Mentioned before, it was not rebuilt until the monarchy time period of Solomon and Rehoboam. And you might remember this story. This is one of the reasons that Israel would become divided. Because in the time of Solomon, Sodom became a major agricultural storage city, which means like a tax collection city, because they taxed everybody. Solomon greatly increased the taxes, which generally would be agricultural produce, on the people all over the whole kingdom, including this area across the Jordan River. His son Rehoboam went against the advice of the elders and increased it even more. Hundreds of silos have been found in Sodom. These are needed for these excessive taxes or grain. Paper and coin currency were not used until 500 BC, many, many years later. And like as I mentioned, that's a big reason they divided. So these silos are everywhere across the top of the el-Hammam, or Sodom. The one on the right is a pretty big one. The one on the left is a smaller one. I'm going to circle it. You can see some artifacts in the middle of it right there. That's my wife Sherry working in this area. But they're everywhere, indicating that this was a tax collection center, a storage center for all this produce. Now, here's a really great reproduction map of what it probably looked like. The upper city, you can see it's much smaller. Obviously, the wealthy people of any upper city, they usually lived in the upper city. That would be their prime location. Now, up in that area was a place of homes and also a place for the king's palace. And see the arrow pointing to the rampant walls. There were really steep walls, and I'm going to show you a little video of that area in just a second. That very area where the arrow is, in fact. And they're made up of just millions and millions of mud bricks. I'll show you a picture of those too in a minute because we run into them everywhere. They were coated with clay, and this is a very steep area, so very hard for the enemy to get in. And if you look to the left, the lower city, these are much smaller, mud brick homes. A lot of them are kind of connected to each other. There was a temple in the center. The city walls on top of that rampart wall were 15 feet thick, 40 feet high with defense towers everywhere. So, in other words, nobody's going to conquer this place. It's so huge. It's so wealthy, and they're amazing. The great wealth and fortifications led to total arrogance, one of the major condemnations that God had against the city. That's where the palace was. We'll look at that. That's the center of a lot of the study, right in this area. The king during the time of Abraham, his name was Bera. He's in the Bible. And there's the gate that we're going to look at in a minute. That's the gate where Lot would have sat. And we'll look at that. Now, here's those rampant walls. Here's a brief video. And you see how steep they are. Now, these bricks were huge, 2 feet by 1.5 feet, 28 times the size of a typical brick we use in the United States. They estimate at least 200 million were used. Really don't know. There might have been much bigger than that. Now, they were sun-baked in the summer because in the summer, this area is really hot. It gets to be 115, 117 degrees. You couldn't have kilns to ever bake to make this number of bricks. So they use the sun. Very effective. And they're really hard. And I'll testify that, and so will Sherry, because we run into these everywhere, and we kept thinking that's a stone. Eventually learned it's a brick. Now, Sodom was right in the center of a lot of trade routes, which is very significant in terms of a place becoming wealthy. Now, here's the king's palace. It's very, very huge. It's massive, much bigger than the White House complex. And in the distance, you can see some of the upper city homes. It's kind of a narrow area. And as I mentioned, that's the area we work. So here's a couple pictures. This is the upper city. This is the King's Palace. Another picture, a short video. Okay, very significant area for all the discoveries they made. Many of these are always found. They're grinding stones. They're necessary in order to grind the grains down to make bread, that type of thing. Because outside these big cities were always many farms, many fields that people work to bring the food back to the city. And these have been found too. The mini ovens, they're called tanur in Hebrew. And I mentioned in the Bible, it's often used as a symbol for judgment. And with arrows pointing, something kind of mysterious or unusual, I should say, is found here and found all over the place. This is just an example of one of the ones that was found when we were there. And there were jars with tiny little infant bones and some little trinkets along with them were put in the jars, and they were buried under homes. So it's a real mystery. What was this about? It's likely it was child sacrifice, which was common in the ancient world in a city like Sodom. Would be pretty likely the case. There's some thought that it might have been a child that had died, and they wanted to bury it under the home as a sense of honoring the child. It's really not known. My guess is it's likely child sacrifice. So many children died in childbirth. Probably like 3 out of 4 back in those days. Okay, we found these everywhere, these shekel weights, and the ones that they're used to weigh grain or to actually make a transaction here on the scales. And the ones we found were big. What does that mean? That indicates wealth. When you find large weights, that indicates large transactions. So it's a very wealthy area. Now, there was a massive influence of the Greek world on Sodom, and we know that for sure. And possibly this is a major source of their sexual depravity, and I'll look at that in a second. So many items of pottery found that are Greek. This is Greek. These swipes on here, these colors are very much Greek. And the Dr. Collins, of course, would know that. Anyone who knows pottery would understand. And these elaborate pottery jars are Mycenaean and Minoan. Those are 2 areas of Greece, indicate great wealth. Some of these are decorated, you can see a little bit on the inside even. And these actually stay in Jordan. They're not able to take these back to the United States. These ones that come in fully intact like this, or almost intact. Now, here's a map of Greece. And you see where it says Minoan. That's the island of Crete. And in Mycenaean, that's the southern part of Greece. And pottery was found from both. And the Minoan area, the gate structure, totally unique to that island, was a gate that was used in Sodom. And that becomes very significant too. I'll show you that in a minute. Now, what do I mean by the influence of the Greeks on the people of Sodom? Well, it was required for young boys raised in a pederastic relationship with older men for 8 years. Now, homosexuality was not uncommon in the ancient world, but in this part of the world, it is at a new perverse level. So let's go to that. We're looking to the king's palace towards the upper city homes. And very, very little of this has been explored or excavated, just a very small area, and that's where we worked. This is the area we worked in throughout this region. Found lots of artifacts down here. This is a really old one. Dr. Collins said this is probably dated about 2,200 years old, a portion of probably a water jar. Sherry found this. It could be a vertebrae. We're not sure. It'd have to be tested. You can't test everything because it's incredibly expensive, so they got to be selective. But human bones that were found in Sodom were just fragments, just tiny pieces, indicating explosive destruction, which we'll look at in a minute. Another view here, we're making very precise measurements. Everything is very precise in archaeology. Like I said, it's kind of like a crime scene in a way. So it's got to be done extremely methodically. And the arrow points to the side. Something was found over there that was really incredible. And what this is actually the skeletal remains, they believe, of a woman who, you can't see in the picture, but it looked like she was carrying something like a jar, water jar possibly. And they believe, and the only kind of figuring this out, just trying to guess what happened, they can tell that a wall had collapsed and it might have collapsed on top of her. And this is dated 500 years before Sodom's destruction, so probably around 2200 BC era. Now, we took a trip down in the lower city, even though we didn't work down there, so we're going to look at some highlights down there. You can see this area down here in the lower city. A lot of this is fields now. This is private land. Some of it's being farmed. There's some banana trees in the area. This is where Dr. Collins and his group worked when they first started this whole project. There's a lot of dark, really dark soil. That's actually from the destruction level, the burning of Sodom, the part that was destroyed. You can actually still see it in many places. Right here, this area that's plowed up is actually from way back in time, from back then. Now, what we're seeing in front of you here are some city wall remnants from these massively high walls. And they can tell by the width of these what type of wall they could support. The archaeologists have all that information. So we're going to see the city gate. Let's look at that for a minute right here. And the city gate looked like this. And remember, Lot sat in the gate of Sodom. So he at first was in a tent area, and he eventually moved into the city. Now, why do I say he became a leader? Because only the leaders sat in the gate. So somehow Lot became well known in the city and well respected. So because he did sit in the gate. Now, with a large gateway, but a very, very narrow entrance. Now, these are really tall towers, like at least 3 stories, maybe 4 stories tall, where the soldiers could stand right on top to protect. Sodom was a fortified city. I mentioned before that sister cities or towns would come here during an attack. Notice how the gate itself going in is pretty narrow. That was very unusual. This whole gate structure is Minoan. It's from Crete. It is very different than anything else in the whole area, in this whole region of Israel or Jordan. And the one on the left shows an inside look, these pillars, this narrow area going into the pillars. The one on the right is more like you'd find in Israel. They're called Solomon gates or Solomonic gates. They kind of would go like zigzag in one way, turn the other way, and go in. Very, very different. So this is a huge clue that obviously why in the world did Sodom have a gate that was Minoan? Well, obviously there was an influence there. These are some of the pillar foundations for those gigantic guard towers. And again, they could support a structure 3 to 4 stories high. This is us sitting actually in the gate, what it would be, what's left of it today. It's this narrow region here, my wife Sherry and I. So Lot likely lived in a freestanding home. We know that from a clue in the scriptures because all the men from every part of the city of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house. And most of the homes of the old city were not ones that could be surrounded because they're like connected, like kind of like adobe huts. But right here, pretty close to the gate, we found, or I shouldn't say we found, they found it years ago, this, which I know is a little hard to put it all together, but it's a multi-room house. It's really different than anything else in the whole lower city. There's some thought this might have been Lot's house. Don't know for sure, clearly, but there's a good chance it would have been because he was a leader and he maybe didn't live in the upper city because he really wasn't one of them originally. This could have been his home in the lower city, right near the gate, possibly. Now, the events of that fateful day, do we know what happened? Okay, so let's look. In Genesis 18, Abraham and 3 visitors who had visited him first to announce they were going to have a son, of course, Isaac. Now, when they got ready to leave, they walked over and looked down towards Sodom. So from Hebron is where they were, Sodom. You can see because it's a huge cliff and Sodom's way down low. Then the Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin is so grievous, that I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will know." The men turned away, and they went towards Sodom. But Abraham remained standing before the Lord. And in the next chapter, there's only going to be 2, and they're described as angels, which is interesting. And then that's when this happened, when Abraham decided to bargain with God because he wanted to see if there's a way to save the city. He said, "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous?" He started with 50 and he worked his way all the way down to 10. And God said, "Okay, for the sake of 10, I will not destroy Sodom." All right, and Abraham's hoping maybe they can find 10. Then the next chapter, the 2, not the 3 this time, angels, as they're described, arrived in Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of the city. When he saw them, he got up to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground, indicating he knew that they were, he had an idea who they were. "My lords," he said, "please turn aside to your servant's house. You can wash your feet and spend the night and then go on your way early in the morning." "No," they answered, "we will spend the night in the square." What do they mean by that? Well, they're talking about the market square. That was always on the inside of the gate, always, right on the inside. That was kind of like a business area, buying and selling. It was a gathering place of people. So it would be on inside the gate, which actually would be really close to Lot's house. Why did Lot refuse their request to stay in the market square? Well, I think he probably knew, he clearly knew what the people were like. He thought, no, they needed security in my house. So here's what it looks like today. Lot's house would be to the left, and then that market square, I'm sitting in the gate again, would be right behind me in that whole area. This, again, today, so many years later. Lot insists his visitors come to his house, eat a meal, but before resting for the night, then the crowd gathered. They insisted on having sex, which is literally raping the 2 visitors. Lot offered his daughters, but they persisted. Lot's 2 visitors pulled him back into the house and struck the mob with blindness. The 2 men said to Lot, "Do you have anyone else here, sons-in-laws, sons or daughters, or anyone else in the city who belongs to you? Get them out of here, because we are going to destroy this place." But it was only Lot, his wife, and daughters. When he hesitated, the men grasped his hands and the hands of his wife and 2 of his daughters and led them safely out of the city. For the Lord was merciful to them. Soon as they had brought them out, one of them said, "Flee for your lives. Don't look back. Don't stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains or you'll be swept away." That idea of swept away is going to be significant here when you understand what happened. Lot pleads to go to the city of Zoar. Then the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. Then he overthrew those cities. Out of the heavens is significant. It's coming from above here. Thus he overthrew those cities and the entire plain, the Kikar, this whole area, not just Sodom, but Gomorrah and all the other cities of the plain, destroying all those living in the cities and also the vegetation of the land. But Lot's wife looked back. She became a pillar of salt, and we'll look more at that later. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and he returned to the place where he had stood before the Lord. He looked down towards Sodom and Gomorrah, towards all the land of the plain. And he saw dense smoke rising from the land, like smoke from a furnace. And again, that's that whole idea of judgment, smoke from a furnace coming up here. So what happened? What happened to Sodom? Well, that story is fascinating. Several years ago, a piece of pottery from a storage jar began to put this whole thing together, and here it is. Now, the reason this put the story together is because this piece of pottery and many, many others that were found after had a really thin little layer of green glass, which is super puzzling. How in the world did that get on there? Because that's not something they had or used back in those days. It was really, really narrow, just very, very skinny, just a tiny little band. Among Dr. Collins' helpers was an older man who had worked on the New Mexico Trinity Project with Oppenheimer, developing the first atomic bomb. Now, I believe this most definitely was God involved here, that this man was here. He was very old at the time. This was, I think, over 10 years ago, 12 years ago. And he's since passed away. But he worked on the New Mexico project with Oppenheimer, amazingly. He looked at it because Dr. Collins didn't know what it was. And he said, let me see it. And he said, that's trinitite. And Dr. Collins says, what's trinitite? It's not something they work with or ever seen before as archaeologists. Well, what it actually is, it's melted sand from massive heat, just thousands and thousands of degrees of heat. And it was because it was so tiny, so very narrow. It must have been, they could deduce, but that the idea that the heat had to be in just a really brief instant, just really, really short, just massive amount of heat. So that was puzzling. And now, the older gentleman was part of this project in New Mexico. It was August 9, 45, 3 weeks before the Japan bombing. And the temperatures of that bomb was about 12,000 degrees. So obviously the atomic bombs are massively hot. Now, this is side by side. To the right is that first piece, a pottery jar with that trinitite. And to the left is from New Mexico. The desert sands that were melted into this. So they match up, and that become like, wow, what's going on here? Extensive testing. So in other words, they just kept looking closer, because that's what you do. It's like a scientific method. Extensive testing back in New Mexico with electron microscopes, chemical compositions, and countless other tests. Similar massive heat event like an atomic bomb was their conclusion. But 1700 BC, are you kidding me? How could that possibly be? There could be no atomic bomb back then. Now, we've all seen meteor showers because they're pretty common. Those are meteors burning up in you before they get into the Earth's atmosphere, or just barely as they enter. And they're fairly common. Every now and then, a meteor will come in and penetrate the Earth's atmosphere and actually hit the Earth, creating a crater. And on occasion, once in a while, one of these will come in and they explode right before they hit the Earth, become a gigantic fireball. And they can be 15,000 degrees or even higher. Now in Genesis 19:24, it says, then the Lord rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone, which is gopreth in Hebrew, and fire, which is ash in Hebrew, from the Lord out of the heavens, not the earth, the heavens. And he overthrew those cities, and all the plain, and all the inhabitants of the cities, and that which grew upon the ground. Now, gopreth, which translated as brimstone, is really better translated as lightning, combined with ash, which is fire. So we got this whole idea of this fireball coming down to the earth. Rarely do these things hit the earth. When they do, the temperatures are greater than an atomic bomb. They can be actually much greater. Now, never in the history of the world do we have knowledge of them hitting a city, except one time. And we believe, Dr. Collins believes, and all the scientists, most of them who have worked on this, believe this is exactly what happened in Sodom. Okay? Now, this is a gigantic study that's really important. It's a secular institution, scientific reports. They did a huge study on all this data, all this information about el-Hammam, Sodom. And here's their conclusion. A Tunguska-sized airburst destroyed el-Hammam, a middle-aged bronze city in the Jordan Valley near the Dead Sea. So what in the world is that? What's Tunguska? What was it? Where was it? Well, it was in Siberia. It was in 1908. There was a massive airburst that came down, exploded right above that area of Siberia. 830 square mile area, destroyed 80 million trees at least. When it came in over Europe, came out, actually over England, over London, and it lit up the night sky. It was so bright. That was called Tunguska. That was an airburst that exploded, which the definition one is that they explode before they hit the earth. It's like a fireball. It's like this gigantic fireball. We present evidence that, this is the actual conclusion, kind of a summary, that back then, about 1650 BC, a cosmic airburst destroyed el-Hammam, a middle-aged bronze city in the southern part of the Jordan Valley, northwest of the Dead Sea. The proposed airburst was larger than the 1908 explosion over Tunguska, Russia, where a 50-mile wide detonated. 1,000 times more energy than Hiroshima atomic bomb. This was their conclusion of this institution who did extensive studies over this. Now, let's look a little bit closer of what they determined would be the direction of the destruction here. And they believe it came from the southwest, which would be down to the left there, at that part of the Dead Sea, the southern part, and it went up towards Sodom, like this. So where do they conclude that type of idea? How do they come up with that concept? Well, they look at in the destruction of Sodom, they found all these pottery jars and all these objects that were literally become part of the wall. They were blown right into the wall, and they could tell by the angle. Nobody had ever seen anything like this. So whatever explosion it was, just stuck all this and penetrated the actual walls. So it was very unusual. And again, they could tell by the direction. It had come down the Dead Sea by the direction of where those jars had gone. So the Dead Sea there would have been some vaporization of this massive amount of salt in the Dead Sea. So in other words, it picks up a large amounts of salt, and it's going to move it forward towards the Kikar, towards Sodom. As evidence, there is pottery found everywhere, even all over the cities of the plain, of pottery that had salt blazed right into it, just embedded into it, which is a massive force, of course, in order to do something like that. Examples of this were found everywhere. So what about Lot's wife when she hesitated? We don't know exactly where she stopped or whatever, but she looked back because maybe she was thinking about her house, possessions, who knows? It's hard to know. Something made it happen. But what probably happened was this salt plume, we talked about her turning into a pillar of salt, was like a gigantic, just a mass of air filled with salt, almost like razor blades flying through the air. So that would have killed her instantly if she was in the middle of that. And likely that's probably what happened. As it came down, picked up the salt, and it went towards this area. She must have been within the range of where that was going. Thus, he overthrew the cities and the entire plain, destroying all those living in the cities and also the vegetation of the land. For almost 700 years, the Garden of Eden became a nomadic wasteland from the toxic levels of salt found everywhere in the soil of that date. Eventually, vegetation returned, like 700 years later. Also, it was an ancient custom, kind of a cursing of the ground. When somebody conquered an area, a king, they would a lot of time put salt on the ground to kind of curse it so it couldn't grow anything. So it's almost like that too, is what's going on. So why did it happen? Well, we have many verses in the Bible to describe the reasons, but here's one that kind of summarizes, I think, pretty much everything. In Ezekiel, now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant. They were overfed. They were unconcerned. So we can get this whole idea. They were this great big city. Nobody can touch us. Wealthy. We're the best and we could care less. They did not help the poor and the needy. So these are all reasons right here of that you can picture their extreme arrogance. All this money, we're fine and we could care less about anybody else. We're the best. They were haughty, and very importantly, they did detestable things before me. And we went through that as to what happened with the two angel visitors, what they were trying to do to them, how perverse these people were. Therefore, I did away with them, as you have seen. Now, when Jesus was questioned about the end of days, when he returns, he described a couple things where things are going to be like this. Going to be like this during this end of days. Things are going to kind of go back to this time period. He talked about the days of Noah, And then he talked about Sodom. He said, this will return. It's going to be like this. It was the same in the days of Lot. People were eating and drinking and buying and selling, planning and building. But the day Lot left Sodom, fire and sulfur, lightning rained down from heaven and destroyed them all. It will be just like this on the day the Son of Man is revealed. Now that's pretty sobering to think about that. He's literally describing that event, or that's what it was like, what was like in Sodom. And again, this is the area I worked in Sherry and others. And it was really hard not to think at times, as you're sitting down in here working, you kind of looking a little bit above where we were, where the destruction level was, that these people were living their lives. They were just, doing their daily, whatever that was, their daily work, their daily chores, eating their food, their meals. And of course, we know that it's extremely wealthy, extremely arrogant, and extremely perverse. And in a split second, they were gone. This destruction happened absolutely instantly. It was so fast. And it was kind of sobering to think about that. And I think everyone down here did from time to time, how fast this is over. And it's really quite incredible, quite a picture. So thank you for this is a little bit longer than some of them because I had a lot to cover here. So I kind of apologize for that. But anyway, I appreciate your watching today, this lesson on returning to Sodom. And my wish for you is shalom.